One small errand of kindness undid weeks of his worst fear. The jar was on the porch rail when I came up from the barn. Blackberry preserves. No note. The lid had a square of red cloth tied under the ring, the way some women do when they mean it as a gift and not just a trade. I stood there in my barn coat with my hands dirty from the wheel hub I'd been fighting all morning, and I looked at that jar for longer than made sense. Tried to think who might have left it. Couldn't come up with anybody. The road down from the gate was empty. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, and most of the leaves were down. And the yard was quiet except for the sound of the cattle out behind the barn, and a magpie doing whatever magpies do on cold mornings. I picked the jar up, set it back down, picked it up again, and carried it inside. That was late October. I didn't eat the preserves, put them in the cabinet next to the flour and didn't think about them again, or tried not to. My name is Gideon Crail. I'm not much for telling stories about myself. Never have been. But my daughter Ellen said something last spring, said she wished she'd heard more of them while she was growing up, and I've been sitting with that ever since, trying to figure out how a man is supposed to fix something like that when the years are already spent. You can't get the years back, but maybe you can put some of them down on paper, which is different from getting them back but is something. I run a cattle operation in the Powder River country. Did then, do still, though it's smaller now than it was, and some days I think it will get smaller still before it gets bigger. Not a grand spread, 300 and some head. A good well. A house that needed roofing but got a coat of paint instead because I could do the paint myself, and the roof would have cost money I didn't have. My wife Nora had died the previous January, 14 days into the new year. The 14th, which I notice still every year and probably will until I don't notice anything anymore. She had been sick for 2 years before that, and I had spent those 2 years learning how to be a man whose wife is dying, which is a particular kind of education, hard and slow and permanent. And then January came and I had to learn how to be a man whose wife is dead, and those are not the same lesson at all. The first one, you are still looking after her, still doing things, still useful. The second one, you are just left, standing in a house that has the same furniture and the same smell and the same view from every window, but it is a fundamentally different house. By October, I was doing a fair imitation of a functioning person. I fed the cattle. I kept the books, such as they were. I answered the phone when the bills got pressing enough that I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard it. I ate something that resembled meals and slept something that resembled sleep, and went through the days in a manner that would have looked, from the road, like a man going about his business. I had a hand named Ott who worked 4 days a week and had worked for me for 11 years. Ott is a quiet man, which is part of why he and I have always gotten along. He showed up, worked hard, didn't talk more than the job required. He had known Nora and liked her, and after she died he said so once simply and then didn't bring it up again. I was grateful for that in ways I don't know how to measure. Between us we were keeping the place going. That was what I told myself. Going. The second jar appeared on a Wednesday in early November. Same place, the porch rail. Same red cloth under the ring. This time it was apple butter, nearly brown, and when I held it close it smelled of cloves, thick winter smell. It reminded me of something I couldn't place, like a word on the tip of your tongue, and the not placing of it bothered me more than the jar itself. I looked up and down the yard. The road was empty. The sky was the flat gray that means it isn't going to do anything today, but you better plan for tomorrow. Whoever had left it was long gone. I put the apple butter next to the blackberry and closed the cabinet. Now I should tell you something about how I was actually doing, because what I've told you so far is what I was doing, and those are 2 different things, and I knew it even then. I'd gotten quieter than I'd ever been in my life, and I had never been a loud man. I would go whole days without speaking more than a dozen words. Ott and I would work side by side for 6, 7 hours mending fence, sorting cattle, cleaning equipment, and the silence between us was like the silence between 2 rocks on a hillside, just the natural condition. At night I ate standing up sometimes, or I'd sit at the table with food I'd made and then look up and the food would be cold and I couldn't account for the time between. It wasn't grief, or not only. Grief I could have explained. This was something quieter than grief and harder to name. The part of me that had cared about the sequence of the day, eating, sleeping, washing up, being a person who does the things a person does, that part had gotten very distant. Like a sound you can still hear, but can't make out anymore. I knew it was happening, knowing it didn't change it. My nearest neighbor to the east was a woman named Clara Petch. Widow like me, though she'd been one for 6 years by then. Her husband had died of a fever and left her with 160 acres, 2 draft horses, no debt, and a dog. She'd been managing it herself since, and managing it well, from what I could see from the road. I knew her the way you know people out in that country. Well enough to wave from a truck, well enough to ask after her horses if you heard one was lame, well enough to know her last name and the names of her animals and the general shape of her life, without knowing much that was real about it. Nora had liked her, used to bring things over in summer, tomatoes, squash, whatever the garden was doing. I hadn't done that after Nora died. I hadn't done much of anything like that. I'd let even the waving lapse. It was a Thursday in the second week of November when I came back from riding fence to find an old blue Chevrolet truck with a dented right fender parked in my yard. Clara Petch was sitting on my porch steps with a paper bag between her boots. I pulled up and got down. I probably looked like I felt, which was tired and dirty and not much interested in company. "Clara," I said. "Gideon?" She stood up and held out the bag. "I was in town this morning picking up feed. Haverson at the drugstore said you had an order sitting 3 weeks, said you'd told him you'd be in." I had forgotten entirely about the order. Some salve for my hands, which crack bad in cold weather, and a prescription, one I'd been on for years, for something that is my business and not relevant here except as a fact about the kind of man I'd been becoming. The prescription I would get to in a minute. "He said he didn't feel right sending it home with just anyone," she said, "but I've been known to Haverson for 30 years, so he sent it with me." She wasn't heading home past my gate. Her property is east, which puts her gate well south of the main road into town. She'd come 8 miles out of her way. I knew that, and she knew I knew it, and neither of us addressed it. I took the bag, said thank you. We stood in the cold, packed dirt of my yard with the wind moving the dead cottonwood leaves across the ground and one of my cows doing something loud out behind the barn. Clara Petch looked at me the way someone looks when they're measuring a situation. Not unkindly, just taking stock. "You eat today?" she said. The honest answer was I couldn't quite remember. I said I was about to. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. "All right," she said, and got back in the truck and drove out. I stood in my yard and watched the truck go down the road. Then I went inside. I set the paper bag on the counter and stood there a while. The cabinet with the 2 jars was closed. I looked at it. Something was working its way around in me, something slow and reluctant, like a wheel that hasn't turned in a long time. She'd been leaving those jars. I don't know why it took me that long to put it together. Maybe because I hadn't been putting much of anything together for a while. Maybe because the idea of being paid that kind of quiet attention by anyone had become so foreign to me that my mind just didn't go there. But once I understood it, I understood something else too, understood it the way you understand something you've been avoiding understanding. I had been sinking. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way a post sinks when the ground is soft, so slowly you don't notice it from day to day, only when you step back and look. The prescription I kept forgetting to pick up was for a kind of darkness, the kind that comes with a certain kind of loss and doesn't always leave on its own. I had been on it for 2 years during Nora's illness, had meant to keep on it after, had been forgetting, or not exactly forgetting, more like not caring whether I remembered or not. The distinction matters. I sat down at my kitchen table, which I hadn't done in the middle of the day in weeks. just sat there. Luther, Clora's big brown stupid dog, wasn't there, but I thought about what it would be like if he was, and I thought about what it would be like if there was coffee on and someone else had made it, and I thought about what it would be like to eat a meal across from another person. Then I got up and made eggs. Enough for two. Ott came in at noon and I handed him a plate and he sat down across from me and ate without asking any questions about it, which is why Ott has worked for me for 11 years. We drank coffee and Ott said, "Weather's turning," and I said, "I think tonight," and Ott said, "Probably," and that was the whole conversation. 2 men, a table, coffee, eggs, weather. I had not done a normal thing in a long time. I'd forgotten that normal things were available. Here is what I knew about Clora Petch by then. She was maybe 55, somewhere in there. Her hair had gone fully gray since the last time I'd really looked at her, and it suited her face. She spoke plain, didn't waste words, didn't fill silences with noise. Her place was well kept, small herd, good fence lines. A kitchen garden she took seriously every summer. She drove that old Chevrolet like she'd drive it until it quit, and then fix it herself. She had a daughter in Billings she saw a few times a year. The dog, Luther, was a large, cheerful animal of no particular breed who wanted to put his face into the hand of every living thing he met. What I didn't know was what she was doing. Or I knew what she was doing. She was paying attention to a man she decided needed it. What I didn't know was why, or what she expected from it. I thought about both questions more than I wanted to. I didn't go ask her. I'm not built that way, but I started picking up my prescription on time. December came in cold and dry, and stayed that way. I had a run of equipment trouble. The baler gave out, which is never a good time for a baler to give out, and then the water heater in the barn cracked, and I spent 2 days fixing that in temperatures that didn't encourage it. Ott and I worked long days, and I was tired in the way that is physical and honest and different from the tired that had been following me around since January. Physical tired you can sleep off. I was in better shape than I'd been in October. I knew that. I was eating properly most days. I'd written Ellen a real letter, 3 pages, talked about the cattle, talked about the baler trouble, asked about her kids, told her a thing or two about her mother that I'd been keeping to myself because I thought I was protecting her from it and had finally realized I was just keeping it from both of us. She wrote back right away. Said she'd been waiting for a letter like that. Said she'd been worried. I wrote back and said she didn't need to worry. She wrote back and said she'd believe that when she saw it. In early December, I drove over to look at a bull. A man named Ferris was selling off his operation. The price wasn't worth the animal. I drove home, and a mile past Clora's gate I saw the old blue Chevrolet pulled half off the road with the hood up. I stopped. She was standing in front of the engine with her hands on her hips and her collar up against the wind. When I got out of my truck, she said, without preamble, "Fan belt." "You got a spare?" I said. "No." "Let me check mine." She did have a spare, it turned out, but it was the wrong size, and it was 30 miles to the nearest parts store. I had replaced my own fan belt in the spring and had kept the old one in my toolbox, which is a habit of mine, keeping parts that might be good for something someday. The old belt was cracked and I wouldn't have trusted it on my truck, but it was there and it was her size and I said so. "It might get you home," I said, "or as far as Dunkel's store if it gives out and you can call from there." "I'll take my chances," she said. I put it on. My hands were bad that day, the knuckles cracked deep and bleeding a little in a few places, which happens to me in December regardless of what I do about it. The routing on her truck was different from mine, and I had to work mostly by feel-in behind the alternator, which wasn't comfortable. She held the hood up and handed me tools when I asked for them, and didn't say anything I didn't ask her to say. When I came out from under the hood, I was cold through, and my right hand was bleeding from where I'd skinned it on a bracket. "Let me see that," she said. "It's nothing," I said. She looked at my hand anyway because I'd held it up to wipe it on my jacket, and she said, "You should put something on that." Then she got a small kit from behind her seat, not a medicine kit, just a kit, the kind a practical woman carries, and handed me a folded square of gauze and some tape without making anything of it. I taped my hand while she started the truck. It caught and held. "Thank you," she said through the window. "Even," I said. She looked at me. "Are we keeping track?" I didn't have an answer for that. I followed her home, a quarter-mile back, just watching the taillights. They held all the way to her gate. She pulled in and I kept on down the road without stopping. That night I opened the blackberry preserves, put some on bread and ate it at the counter standing, which I was still doing too much of. It was better than I'd expected. Dark and thick, not sweet enough to be cloying, tasted like someone had picked those berries herself and cooked them down slow. I ate 4 pieces of bread with it, and then I washed the plate and put it away and looked out the window at my dark yard and thought about a woman who picks her own blackberries and still makes enough to give away to a neighbor she barely knows. Christmas came. Ellen and her husband brought the 2 kids out for 4 days. I had cleaned the house properly, first time in a while, and bought good food and borrowed a bed frame from Ott so the grandkids each had a proper place to sleep. The 4 days were, I don't know the right word for them, full, loud in the house in a way that felt strange and then gradually didn't. The kids were 9 and 6, and they ran in and out and asked me questions about the horses and the cattle, and why the well worked the way it worked, and I answered all of them, and somewhere in the middle of that I realized I was enjoying it. Ellen watched me the way she always watches me, that careful look she has. On the 3rd day, when we had a moment alone, she said, "You seem better." I said I was getting there. She said, "Dad, are you really?" I said yes, and I meant it more than I had the last time she'd asked, which had been at Nora's funeral, when it wasn't true at all and we both knew it. She hugged me before they left, held on a minute, her face against my shoulder. She's not a small person, takes after her mother's side, and it's been a long time since she held on to me like that. I held on back. The car went down the road and I stood in the yard until I couldn't see it anymore. Then I went inside and sat at the table with coffee and thought about what I was and what I'd been, and what the distance between those 2 things looked like now versus what it had looked like in October. I was better, not fixed, not whole, not whatever I'd been before Nora got sick, but better. The lamp was burning at something close to its proper height, and I was tending it, and that was different from what I'd been doing in October, which was not tending it and also not quite admitting to myself that I wasn't. I wrote Clara a note, Christmas adjacent. Thanked her for the preserves without being specific about why I was thanking her in December for preserves she'd left in October. Said I hoped her holiday was good. Asked after the draft horse I'd heard had a stone bruise. It was a plain note, and I sent it without much deliberation, which was progress of a kind. The old version of me would have written it and then sat on it and eventually talked himself out of sending it. She sent back a card. The horse was sound. The holiday was quiet. She hoped my grandchildren had enjoyed the ranch. It was the 2nd week of January, a year and a day after Nora had died, and I was not counting, but I was counting, when the ice storm came in. It came from the northwest the way the bad ones do, quiet and settled and looking like nothing particularly serious from the south. I had cattle out in 3 pastures, and I'd meant to consolidate them, but I'd meant to do it the day before, and then the baler had needed attention, and then it was evening, and then it was morning, and the ice was there. Every wire and board and dead grass stem wrapped in a 1/4 inch of clear ice. Beautiful, if beauty was what you were in the market for. I lost 2 cattle to a fence they couldn't see. Found them in the morning. That's not a good way to start a day, and there's not much to say about it except it happened, and I dealt with it, and moved on to the rest of what needed doing. Ott couldn't get up the road for 2 days. The incline coming off the main road was a skating rink, and his truck didn't have the weight to hold the tires down. He called from the highway, and I told him to stay home, which he didn't want to do but agreed to. I told him I had it. I had it in the sense that I was doing the work, breaking ice off the tank heaters, which had frozen over on the north side anyway, getting feed out on the slick ground, which meant going slow and watching my feet, checking fence to see where else the ice had come down on the wire. My back had been bad since November, a thing I'd done to it in the summer and hadn't treated properly, and working in the cold made it worse. And by the second day, I was moving carefully and eating ibuprofen and not sleeping well. The second evening I was in the barn at maybe 9 o'clock. I had a lantern going because the electric in the barn is unreliable in bad weather, and the horses were in their stalls, and I had sat down on an upturned feed bucket for a reason I couldn't explain and was just sitting there looking at the floor. I wasn't thinking about anything particular. I wasn't planning tomorrow. I wasn't working out a problem. I was just sitting there with the lantern throwing yellow light on the stalls and the horses shifting and ticking and the ice doing something to the roof above me and not moving. That was the state I was in when the truck pulled into the yard. I came out of the barn and the headlights were Clora's. She got out with a covered dish, and a flashlight, and Luther came out behind her and immediately came over to put his whole face against my leg. "I made too much stew," she said. "Luther's been underfoot all day and I needed to get him out of the kitchen." The flashlight was pointed at the ground between us. Her face was wind-burned, her collar up, her boots solid on the ice. She was holding that dish like coming over with stew at 9 in the evening during an ice storm was a perfectly ordinary thing, and maybe to her it was. "You eat," she said. I thought about it honestly. "Not since this morning," I said. She nodded. "All right," she said. "You want to eat inside." It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite an order. Just a statement of the next reasonable thing. We went inside. I hadn't had a woman in my kitchen since Nora. There's a specific quality to it, the presence of a woman in a room that has been only yours for a long time, that I don't know how to describe except that you become aware of the room in a way you haven't been, where things are and how they look and whether the floor is swept. Clora went about it with none of the self-consciousness I felt. She found the bowls without asking, second shelf, right side, where they've been for 30 years, and found the spoons and put the dish on the table, and that was that. She had brought enough for two, which meant she'd planned to stay, which meant she'd known what she would find when she got here. Luther settled under the table and put his chin on my boot. His chin is very heavy. She sat across from me and we ate. The stew was beef, plain and good, not dressed up. Outside the wind was doing something serious against the north windows, and you could hear the ice creaking on the fence posts. Inside it was warm and lit, and there was food and a dog and a woman who didn't seem troubled by the silence between us. After a while she said, "Bad year." "Yeah," I said. She waited, didn't push it. I said, "Harder than I expected." She said, "I thought I knew what it would be like, losing her. I'd had 2 years to get ready." "You can't get ready for that," she said. "No," I said, "I found that out." I was looking at my bowl. The stew was almost gone. My spoon was sitting in it and I hadn't picked it up in a while. She said, "After Pard died," she stopped. Started again. I thought I was doing fine for about 3 months. I really believed it. I was making good time, I thought. Then March came and the snow started going off and everything smelled different, and I understood that I was nowhere close to fine. "What did you do?" I said. "Kept going," she said. "What else is there?" "I keep hearing that," I said. "I'm not sure I believe it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to believe it, you just have to do it." I looked up at her. She was looking back at me steady, the way she always looked at things, not performing calmness but actually calm, the way people get when they've been through something genuinely hard and come out the other side of it with their feet on the ground. She said, "Those prescriptions." "From Haverson." I didn't say anything. "I know what the one is for," she said. "The one you weren't picking up. Pard was on it too, toward the end." She looked at her hands a moment. "He should have stayed on it, he didn't." She said that last part plain, without editorializing, and I understood what she was not saying just as clearly as what she was. She was not saying he had done something deliberate. She was saying he had been a man who didn't take care of himself the way he should have, and she had watched it, and it had cost him, and she did not intend to watch it happen again from across the road. The weight of that, the weight of being seen that clearly by someone who had come by the knowledge honestly. I didn't have words for it then, and I still don't. I sat with it, the way you sit with something you've put down finally, after carrying it a long time. I've been picking it up, I said. I know, she said. I stopped by Haverson's last week for something else and he mentioned it. He said to tell you hello, but he didn't ask me to pass on anything else, so I figured that was his way of saying you'd been in. She had been checking, not in a meddlesome way, not in a way that would embarrass me, just quietly because she was paying attention. I don't know why you're doing this, I said. She said, because there's no one else close enough to do it. I looked at her. And because, she said more slowly, I've watched what happens to men out here when they go to pieces by themselves and don't let anyone close enough to help. They go very far before anyone notices, and by then, she didn't finish the sentence. I'm not going to pieces, I said. No, she said, not anymore. That landed. I got up and made coffee. Not because I needed to do something with my hands, well, partly because of that, but because there was someone else in my kitchen who might want coffee, and thinking about what another person needed was, in some fashion I couldn't fully explain, a thing I had stopped doing and was starting again, and it seemed worth practicing. She stayed another hour. We talked about small things, her draft horse, the section of fence I'd lost in the storm, the grandkids' visit, the letter I'd written Ellen. She asked about the bull I'd gone to look at from Ferris, and I told her what was wrong with the animal, and she said that sounded about right, that Ferris had a habit of pricing sentiment over merit. When she stood up to go, Luther unfolded himself from under the table and shook, and went away at the door with the patience of a dog who has done this many times. I'll follow you home, I said. The roads are all right, she said. I know they are, I said. I'll follow you anyway. She looked at me for a moment and said, all right. I got my coat and went out and started my truck and followed her taillights down the main road and then her road, watching them red in the dark until they turned through her gate. I sat outside her gate for a minute with the engine running. The ice was still on everything and the stars were out, cold and sharp the way they get when the air is clear and frozen. Then I turned around and drove home. The rest of that winter was different, not transformed, changed, which is different, slower and more honest. I ate my meals sitting down. I answered letters the same week they arrived. I filled my prescription every month on the day it was ready, and I took it every morning with my coffee the way you're supposed to, and it did what it was supposed to do, which is not to make you feel wonderful but to make the lamp burn at something closer to its proper height. Clara and I saw each other through February and March, not in any declared way, not in a way that required naming. She came by on a Saturday in February when I was working a young horse that was giving me grief, throwing his head, and generally being unreasonable, and she leaned on the fence and watched and didn't say anything for 20 minutes, and then said one thing, which was that I was asking him left when I should have asked him right, and that fixed it, and I wasn't sure whether she'd been waiting to say it or it had just come to her. I went over to her place in February and fixed the section of her barn roof that had come down under the ice. It was cold work and my back complained about it, and Ott came with me, and between the two of us, we got it done in half a day. Clara fed us both at noon, soup, bread, coffee, and afterward we sat in her kitchen, and she had the radio going and Ott fell asleep in his chair, which seemed rude, but Clara said he'd earned it. In March, a fence dispute with my neighbor to the south, a man named Tully, came to a head. It had been building for 2 years since before Nora died, and I'd been letting it go because I didn't have the will for it. Tully had been running his cattle over the corner of my south pasture every summer and acting like it was his right. I drove over and talked to him about it. He said some things and I said some things, and when I drove home, I had an agreement that satisfied both of us, and a property line marked with new corner posts that we'd agreed to put in together in April. I told Clara about it on the phone that evening. She said she'd been wondering when I'd get to that. I said some things take the time they take. She said some things you don't deal with until you've got the wherewithal, and now I had it again. That was accurate. I did have it again. The wherewithal not just for fence disputes but for the general business of being a person with a life that needed managing. The rent I owed on a leased grazing section I'd been letting slide. The conversation I'd been putting off with Ellen about the property, about what the plan was long-term, about what happened to the place when I got too old to run it. The roof. I had a man come look at the roof in March and got an estimate and didn't like the estimate but hired him anyway. Because the roof was necessary and borrowing the money was possible, and the house was worth keeping. Spring came the way it comes in that country, sudden and absolute. The snow goes off the hills and the creek comes up brown with it, and everything smells of mud and cold water and something beginning. I have always liked spring for that. Even that year, even still half hollow in some ways I didn't want to examine too closely, I liked it. Clara came over on an afternoon in April. I'd done nothing to merit a visit, no errand to repay, no equipment trouble. She just came over because it was a warm afternoon and there was coffee available, and we had gotten, somewhere between October and April, to the place where coming over for no particular reason was a reasonable thing to do. We sat on the porch in the sun with our coats on, and our coffee, and the yard going soft with the first green of the season. She had one hand resting on the arm of her chair. After a while I reached over and put my hand on top of hers. Just that. The warmth of her hand, which was warm from the coffee mug, her fingers turned and held on. I don't have a lot to say about that moment, except that it was quiet and right, and nothing about it needed to be explained. We sat that way until the light went off the hills, the slow rose-colored light of April evenings in that country, and then she said she ought to get home and feed the animals, and I said I'd walk her to her truck, and she said she knew the way, and I said that wasn't the point. She laughed at that, not a big laugh, just a real one. I walked her to the truck. Luther, who'd been asleep in the sun by the steps, woke up and walked with us in his cheerful, useless way. She got in and started it up and looked at me through the window and said, "I'm going to put a garden in this summer, if you want help with yours." I said I'd want help with mine. "I'll bring starts," she said. "I've got too many anyway." She drove out and I stood in the yard until she was gone, and then a while longer, just standing in the April evening with the dog sitting beside me and the first stars coming up over the eastern ridge. She came back the next morning. Came early, before I'd had my second cup of coffee, which is a sign of a woman who keeps ranchers' hours. She came with a box of starts in the truck bed, tomatoes, peppers, bean seeds, a couple of squash plants, and she looked at the patch of ground where Nora used to have her garden and said, "This ground's good." I said Nora thought so. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I thought I might put some things in here, if that's all right." "That's all right," I said. We put up the deer fence that Saturday, me and Clara and Ott, in the early summer heat. Ott strung wire and I drove posts, and Clara told us both what we were doing wrong and was right most of the time. Afterward we ate on the porch and Ott talked more than he usually did, which might have been the heat, or might have been that Clara was easy to talk to. Luther slept under the table with his chin on the ground, completely satisfied with everything. I am telling you this the way my daughter asked me to. Plain, without a lot of decoration. I don't know that I have words for what it is to be a man who thought he was done and found out he wasn't. Not done in any dramatic sense. I wasn't planning anything, wasn't at any particular edge. Just going quiet, going dim. sinking the way a thing sinks when no one's watching, and there's nothing to catch it. What stopped it wasn't anything dramatic either. It was a woman paying attention to a man she decided needed it, and doing it in small and unremarkable ways: a jar on a rail, an errand she didn't need to run, a covered dish in an ice storm, until the accumulated weight of being noticed became too much to ignore. Until the accumulated weight of being noticed became the thing that held. I'm not a young man. I wasn't then. I have bad hands and a bad back and a roof that I finally fixed and a cattle operation that is modest and will probably stay that way. I am not the man I was at 40. None of that is remarkable and none of it changed. But I eat my meals at the table, sitting down. I write my daughter letters she doesn't have to worry about. I fill my prescription every month on the day it's ready, and I take it with my coffee every morning, and the lamp burns at its proper height now, and I tend it. I have learned, or I am still learning, that tending the lamp is itself the work, every day, and that there is no point in the work at which you are done with it and can stop. And in the evenings, when the light goes off those hills, there is a woman in the chair beside mine, her hand in mine in the dark. Her laugh, which is not a performing laugh but a real one, small and dry, the laugh of a woman who has been through something and found it more survivable than she'd expected. Luther at the foot of the steps, asleep in the way of dogs who feel safe. I think about October sometimes, about the jar on the rail and how long I stood there looking at it. I think about the man I was, the distance I'd been traveling from myself, slowly and without fanfare, the way bad things happen in that country when you're not paying attention. I think about what it means that a woman who barely knew me decided to pay attention anyway. I don't know what I would have come to by myself. I have some guesses and I don't like them. What I know is this: there's no way to account properly for a person who sees you at your worst and decides that's worth something, who keeps showing up in small, plain ways until the small, plain ways become the thing that turns you back around. I've tried to account for it and I can't. It doesn't fit in any ledger I know how to keep. I'm glad I don't have to understand it. I'm glad I just have to live it. That's the whole of it. That's what one small errand of kindness did when I was too hollowed out to know I needed it. It started with a jar on a porch rail, a woman who picked her own blackberries and still made enough to give away. And all the rest of it followed from there, plain as weather, plain as spring. There's one more thing I should say about that winter because I've been circling around it, and I ought to just say it. I went through a period, maybe 3 weeks, somewhere in mid-November, after Clara had driven out to my drugstore and before she showed up with the stew, when I stopped eating properly. Not a decision, not anything I'd have called a plan. Just the days going by and the meals not happening, and the quiet in the house getting a particular quality to it that I didn't want to examine. I know what that quality is now, and I knew what it was then even though I'd been telling myself I didn't. It's the quality of a house where a man has stopped caring about the difference between the next day and no day. That sounds stark. It was stark. I'm saying it because Ellen asked me to tell it plain, and telling it plain means saying that too. I was not going to do anything. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't making plans or looking at anything the wrong way. It was quieter than that. It was the absence of the part of you that argues for itself, that says, "Get up, eat something, this is worth continuing." That part had gotten very still. And Clara had driven 8 miles out of her way because she knew, not guessed, knew, from watching her own husband, what a man forgetting a certain kind of prescription for 3 weeks was likely to mean about the state of that man. She had not made a production of it. She had not said anything alarming or clinical or pitying. She had handed me the bag and looked at me and said, "You eat today," and then she'd gone home and let me sit with it. That was exactly right, I know that now. If she'd done anything more, I'd have closed up. I'm built that way. You come at me head-on with concern and I'll back away from it politely but certainly. She hadn't come at me head-on. She just kept showing up, kept leaving small things, a jar, an errand, a covered dish. the accumulation of being noticed without being confronted. I picked up my prescription the following week. I started eating, not because of a grand decision, more because there was a person who knew I wasn't, and that made a kind of claim on me, not the kind you owe a stranger, the kind you owe someone who's paying attention, like you don't want to waste what they're spending on you. That may not be the most elevated reason to take care of yourself. I'll take it. Ott noticed. Didn't say anything, just started showing up on days he wasn't scheduled for the first couple of weeks after the ice storm. I asked him once why he'd come in on a Thursday when Thursday wasn't his day. He said he'd thought he'd check on the fence on the south line. The fence on the south line was fine. I didn't press it. He'd been working for me for 11 years, and he knew the difference between what I said I was and what I was, the same way you know after 11 years of working alongside a man. He didn't say anything about it because saying something wasn't what I needed, and Ott knew that too. Good men don't always require explaining, they just show up. I thought about that a lot that winter, about the people who had shown up without being asked. Clara and Ott in their different ways. Ellen in her letters, which kept coming through February and March, longer letters than she used to write, full of real things, not just checking in. I had built a life that had people in it, and the people in it had not quit it just because I'd gotten quiet. That was something worth knowing. I'd spent a lot of the previous year believing that I was alone in the way that mattered, that no one was close enough or paying enough attention. Turns out I was wrong about that. I'd just been too far inside myself to see it. One thing Clara said to me, sometime in February, when I'd gone over to help with her barn roof. She said it almost off the side, not looking at me, handing me a board. "You're a hard man to reach when you're not ready to be reached." I said I was working on that. She said, "I know you are, I can tell." And that was it. That was the whole exchange. But I've thought about it many times since, because it seems to me she was saying, I can see the difference between the man you were in October and the man you are now. I see that you're doing the work and it's worth doing. Nobody had said anything like that to me in a long time. Not because people didn't care, Ellen cared, Ott cared in his way, but because I'd been closed up tight enough that there was nowhere to put it. Clara had found a way in, through the side door, through small practical things, through not making it about how I felt but about what I needed. She is a practical woman. That's not a slight. It's one of the things about her that I am most grateful for. There is a kind of love that expresses itself in sentiment and declaration, and I am not saying that's wrong, but it doesn't reach me the way practical love does. The kind that shows up with stew when you haven't eaten. The kind that hands you gauze for your hand without making a speech about it. The kind that follows you home through the dark to make sure the fan belt held. I am a plain man, and she is a plain woman, and what we have built is a plain thing, and I would not trade it. The garden went in that June and came up well. Better than Nora's had in a few years, which I thought was interesting and didn't say out loud. Clara put in the tomatoes on the south end where they get the most afternoon sun, and the beans along the deer fence, and the squash in the corner where the ground is richest. By August, she had so many tomatoes she was giving bags of them to Ott, who took them without comment. Luther spent most of that summer asleep in the shade by the garden, occasionally rousing himself to chase a ground squirrel in a half-hearted way that suggested he knew perfectly well he wasn't going to catch it. In September, I started on the new fencing along the east property line. It was overdue. The old wire was rusting, and a couple of the posts had heaved with the frost over the years and needed resetting. I had the materials and the time, and I went at it over 2 weeks, a section at a time, the kind of work that is satisfying in an uncomplicated way because you can see exactly what you've done at the end of each day. Clara came over one evening while I was still at it, not late, maybe 6, the September light still good, and she looked at what I'd done and ran her hand along the top wire and said, "That'll hold." 2 words, "that'll hold," Coming from a woman who has been keeping her own fences for 6 years by herself, that means something. I'm going to close this where it belongs, which is not on any particular dramatic moment but on an ordinary evening. That's where the real things are, in my experience. Not in the dramatic moments but in the ordinary ones, the evenings, the meals, the drive home in the dark. It's a night in October, a year after the first jar appeared on my rail. Exactly a year, as near as I can figure it. The anniversary is not something we've talked about, and I won't bring it up. Some things don't need naming to be known. We're on the porch. The light is going off the hills. It's cold enough for coats, not cold enough to go inside. Clara has her coffee and I have mine, and Luther is at the foot of the steps with his chin on his paws, his eyes moving back and forth between us in the attentive way dogs have when they're not asleep. The cottonwoods along the creek have gone yellow again. The cattle are quiet. The well pump is doing its thing. She has her hand in mine. Her thumb moves once, just a small movement like she's making sure I'm still there. I am. A man can spend a long time not knowing what he's worth. Can get so quiet about it that the question stops forming, which is the most dangerous kind of quiet. And then a woman decides to pay attention in small ways, in plain ways, in ways that are easy to dismiss and impossible to forget, and the question starts forming again. And the answer to the question turns out to be, you're worth more than you thought. You're worth a jar on a rail. You're worth an 8-mile detour. You're worth stew in an ice storm. You're worth staying for. I hold her hand on the porch in the October dark and I believe it. After a long time of not quite believing it, I believe it. That's what the Errand did. That's what the jar on the rail did. One small thing at the right moment from the right person. That's all kindness ever needs to be. I want to add one more thing before I'm done, because it's something I've been thinking about and I'm trying to put things down plain instead of keeping them to myself, which was always my habit and is not, I've learned, always the better one. The day I sat on that upturned bucket in the barn during the ice storm, not moving, not thinking about anything, just stopped. I have come to understand that that was probably the closest I came to the thing I was trying not to think about. Not the closest in any clinical sense, but the closest in the sense of, I had let myself get so far from anything that mattered that there wasn't much pulling me back anymore. Clara's truck came into the yard, and I heard it and I got up. That's all it took, that's how thin it was, just someone showing up. I've talked to Ellen about some of this. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. She was upset, in the way a daughter is upset when she realizes her father was suffering and she didn't know how bad it was. I told her there wasn't much she could have done differently. She lived 4 hours away and had her own life, and I'd been lying to her, not in words but in omission, for most of the year. She said she should have pushed harder. I said she pushed about as hard as I would have let her. That's the truth of it. Some things a man won't let his children see. It's not pride exactly. It's protection. You want them to think of you as solid as the rock, and sometimes being the rock means not letting anyone see how close to crumbling you are. But there are people who aren't your children, who have no image of you to protect or be protected from, who can look at you level from across the road and see what's actually there. Clara had been looking at me since January. I know that now. She told me later in the spring that she'd been watching me come and go all year, watching the shape of my days, and she'd known by summer that I was in trouble of the quiet kind. She'd been working out what to do about it for months before October. The jars were the thing she landed on, something small enough that I could ignore it and something that said, I see you. I'm here. You haven't gone invisible. It's remarkable when I think about it, the patience of it. The care that went into figuring out a man who would refuse to be helped directly and needed to be helped sideways, obliquely, in ways he could receive. She had thought about me long enough and carefully enough to know how I was built and what I could take. Nobody had done that in a long time. Nora had known how I was built, of course, but she'd been gone. And before she was gone, she'd been sick. And when your wife is sick, she needs you in ways that don't leave room for her to need you differently. I'd been alone with myself for a long time, in the important sense. And Clara had looked over and decided that was long enough. I'll tell you what she told me when I finally asked her directly, sometime in March on the phone. I'd worked up to it over days and then just said it. Why did you? She said, because you're a decent man, Gideon, and there aren't so many of those out here that you can afford to lose one. I said, that's practical. She said, I'm a practical woman. And I laughed. I actually laughed. For the first time in a long time, I laughed at something a person said, and it was genuine and right. And I heard her on the other end of the line make a sound that was also close to a laugh. And that was a good moment, a very simple good moment, and I am glad to have it. I'm glad to have a lot of things now that I wasn't sure I'd keep. The ranch, my daughter's trust. The mornings, which are harder in winter but are mine and which I have made peace with. The evenings, which are better. One jar on a porch rail, one woman paying attention. That's the story, that's all there is to it.